The White House press office banned the New York Post from attending President Biden's only daytime public event yesterday as prosecutors approach a decision on Hunter Biden charges. The Post infamously first covered Hunter's abandoned laptop back in 2020.
In a story from a couple of days ago, Politico reported the White House is bracing for the political fallout from the charging decision in the Hunter Biden case, and apparently they've concluded that Republicans will attack them over it, whether President Joe Biden's son is criminally indicted or not. The article later said Politico has not authenticated the hard drive files that underpinned a New York Post story about the laptop, but Politico confirmed the authenticity of some emails on the drive in a 2021 book. In response to this, journalist Glenn Greenwald wrote, "What Politico is doing here is as transparent as it is deceitful. Even liberal corporate outlets, the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, CBS, now admit they authenticated the Biden laptop. But Politico, the first to spread the lie, can't admit this, or else they'd be forced to retract their story."
Yeah, and it's important to point out, Politico was the most egregious purveyor of that incorrect letter about the laptop story being disinformation. Remember, the letter itself, which was signed by a bunch of former national security officials, used very careful language to avoid getting themselves in trouble, where they said the laptop has all the hallmarks of a Russian disinformation campaign. The Politico headline, I just pulled it up right here, says, "Hunter Biden's story is Russian disinfo," dozens of former intelligence officials say. They did not say it's Russian disinfo. They said it looks like Russian disinformation. And I still think you should criticize them for saying that, but Politico spun it, and that's still up. This story exists. That headline wasn't corrected. It should be correct. It's not accurate. They didn't say that in their letter.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for them to, say, which we've not authenticated, it's really, really shameful.
It does
on their
feel
part.
like they're covering their tracks, and that they are the ones that absolutely cannot talk about this. I mean, what do you make of the broader decision to bar
we should
Post
talk about that.
from the briefing in the first place? Biden's gotten a lot of heat for not doing a lot of interviews with the press, taking questions directly from the press. Here is one of the few opportunities that they have. Does it make sense for them? Is it ethical for them? Is it in line with the hallmarks of journalistic integrity that they were just crowing about in the Correspondents' Dinner a week or so ago?
Absolutely not. And why aren't there the other people in the media? Democracy dies in darkness. Where's the outrage that the White House would restrict access to an outlet that is critical of them, and involved in reporting on what Hunter Biden may or may not be doing? You'd think if the shoe was on the other foot, if it was the Trump administration barring, for instance, the Washington Post, because they didn't like how the Washington Post had reported on some element of the Trump administration, they'd be up in arms. There'd be fury among mainstream media folks.
Yeah, look, it is clear, obviously, that Hunter Biden being charged is going to be characterized as an indictment of Joe Biden and his viability as president and his corruption and all these other things, whether or not that's a legitimate connection to make, whether or not there's proof of that connection to make. However, it is not the job of the White House to preemptively bar an entire media institution from being able to ask questions about what is a newsworthy event. And it seems to me that Biden should spend more time coming up with answers to questions that more than just the Washington Post is going to want to ask about the nature of Hunter Biden being charged, what impact this may or may not have in his campaign. And I would like to hope that other journalists, despite not being on this beat in the way that the New York Post has been, still ask the questions that are completely germane to the public's interest here.
Right. It's worth recalling as well, and I have, when I've talked about this in a radar I did on this, when Joe Biden addressed the laptop story during a debate with Donald Trump, he too used that letter to justify treating it as Russian misinformation. That's what he said when asked about it. He said, and Trump reacted kind of like, "Oh my God, you're doing Russiagate all over again?" He's totally right. That's exactly what Biden went for, and he was allowed to do that, or he had cover to do that, because that's what all those national security officials, who are all talking heads on CNN and other places, that was the cover they provided, and it was totally 100% incorrect.
Yeah, as we covered the Twitter files angle of this story and Twitter's choice to take this story down when it first aired, we argued or at least I argued it in part, that the cover-up would seem to be worse than the crime. You know, the fact of the suppression was a story that had a longer tail on it than the laptop and its contents itself and its relevance to Biden and his campaign and his administration and all of that. And this feels like an extension of that same principle, where in some ways it's more offensive for the White House to bar a news outlet from a press briefing than to, you know, give a pat answer to a question, or to decline to take a particular question, or to kind of fob off and say, well, this isn't that important, and to give the kind of response you might expect in this kind of scenario where they're trying to downplay the relevance of something. I think that would have come across much better than what here seems to be like a fundamental abrogation of their responsibility to the freedom of the press.
Yeah, the cover-up is much worse than the crime. The cover-up is extraordinary actions that were taken to suppress the story on social media. Many of those, to some degree, those decisions freely chosen by the social media companies, but also as part of a broader pattern of federal pressure on them to take misinformation, alleged misinformation, more seriously. Mark Zuckerberg saying he was warned just before Facebook took that action against the story. He was warned by law enforcement that to be on the lookout specifically for something Russian. After he was, publicly pilloried for what happened in 2016, all mainstream forces laying the blame for Trump's election at the feet of Mark Zuckerberg. That was the social media side. Then this extraordinary law enforcement claim that it was Russian disinformation. It wasn't. President Biden able to use that to cover for it. And now they don't even want to talk. They don't even have it in the press briefing room, right, the outlet that broke that story. And then other outlets are going to say, which we have not, other outlets being Politico, we haven't authenticated it. Yeah. It's authenticated. Catch up, guys. Catch up.
And to be clear, I mean, we've talked about this whole time without actually talking about what the charges are, of course. I mean, we've done so in the past, but one is that Hunter Biden failed to report all of his income to the IRS, and two, that he made a false statement in relation to buying a gun in 2018. I think that was, you had to make a statement that you have not had certain drug-related issues, which he misrepresented. And so there's this funny thing that's happened now where, just like we just did, you're able to talk about this issue, and people are probably projecting more than what that Hunter Biden is actually being charged with on the situation, because they're not answering questions directly and talking specifically about what he actually did. I think that a world where Joe Biden simply takes questions and says, my kid didn't file his taxes right. He made a mistake and didn't tick a box he was supposed to as he was exercising a Second Amendment right to, have a gun. Right. I mean, that is what it is, but it has nothing to do with me and my presidency, and your focus on this is politically motivated, yada, yada, yada. He can make those kinds of arguments. But in the absence of a concrete discussion about what's actually happening, you do create this weird kind of mushy void of suspicion where we're just talking about charges against the president's son that he's trying to dodge in a way that I think actually reflects worse and worse on President Biden.
They've made it look more suspicious.
Yeah.
All right, more Rising right after this. Stay with us.